pleasure to introduce my colleague, Thomas Kovach, in his role from the German department. That's where we're most direct colleagues. German studies now. Way back in the day, it was the German department. Tom has his PhD in comparative literature after a bachelor's degree in German studies, but a PhD in comparative literature from Princeton. In 1994, he came to the University of Arizona to head the Department of German Studies, a position he held for 10 years. His focus is on the Jewish participation in Austrian and German literature, not just around 1900, but also from the beginnings of emancipation in the 18th century up to the present day. And now we're going to hear about the sins of the father. Okay, Tom, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. This line, I just want to say that my recent preoccupation with the topic of post-war Germans and how they deal with the legacy of the Nazi past is a relatively new topic for me. I was used to focus more on turn-of-the-century Vienna, still a topic dear to my heart. And as Mary says, at the U of A, I've been very involved in Judaic studies, teaching a course in German Jewish writers, another one on how Jews are represented in German texts through the ages. But in recent years, I have become intrigued and started teaching courses on this whole question of dealing with the past. And in the context of that class, I became acquainted with this remarkable text that I'll be talking to you about today. The writer, Peter Schneider, is really one of the prominent German writers of the post-war generation. He's a little older than I am. He was born in 1940, but he's still very active. However, this story is still a little bit controversial, and I'll go into some of the details about that as we go on. But I wanted to first give a little bit of context for those of you not in German studies. Those of you in German studies are certainly familiar with this very long German word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. But for those of you not in German studies, I'd like to tease that out a bit. The word is usually translated as dealing with the past, although literally it really means mastering, gaining control over the past. And actually, you know, in recent years, a lot of people have questioned the appropriateness of that term, you know, as if one could ever really gain control over the legacy of the Nazi past. And I think certainly one of the things we'll learn from this story is that there is no easy path to that kind of control. This theme has certainly been prominent in German culture and literature throughout the post-war era. But interestingly enough, the Holocaust in particular, most non-Germans, you know, when they think of the Nazi legacy, usually the Holocaust is the first thing people think of. But until the 70s, this was really not much of a topic of discussion. Even, it's interesting, the 1960s generation with student radicals of the 60s who are sort of defined by challenging their parents. You say, what did you do in the war? You know, how did you let this happen? Even they tended not to deal specifically with the Holocaust very much. In the late 70s, this began to change. And everyone, it's remarkable, some of you may remember this US miniseries called Holocaust, starring Meryl Streep and a few others. I remember at the time thinking it was a bit kitschy, and you know, I didn't feel that was appropriate, but it had a huge impact in Germany. I think precisely because it sort of tried to sort of bring the topic down to one family and how they were affected. And it's, you know, almost anything you read about the history of sort of dealing with the Holocaust in Germany singles this out as a major event. Since then, the Holocaust has been a very major part of public discourse in Germany. You know, I think some would say there's been a kind of overcompensation for all the years of silence. I know I've spoken to some young German exchange students who said, oh, you know, that's all we heard about, you know. So this is an ongoing sort of question as to how to deal with it. And, you know, however, this, you know, certainly I think the very good fact that it has been incorporated into public discourse, into education, does not really mean that the problem has been solved. And just as one benchmark in this history, there is this kind of event, if you want to call it that, called the Historikerstreit, or the debate among historians, which really had to do with how to really think about the Holocaust. It was triggered by a fairly conservative German historian who argued that this was in a sense a response to the Stalinist terror and was not a unique event in any sense. Others clearly rejected this and said, that this is an unprecedented, unique event, and we cannot try to, basically smooth this out by just comparing it to others. And the story by Schneider was written really in the wake of this Historikerstreit. So I think it's interesting to keep that in mind. But at the same time, as I think will be clear, the story deals on a much more personal, individual, psychological level. It's not really dealing with the kind of historiographic issues that the historians were. One other kind of interesting phenomenon in the 70s and 80s is what's called Väterliteratur, or the literature of the fathers. And these are a number of works that dealt on a very personal level with Germans born either in the last years of the Nazi regime or in the immediate post-war era, and how they came to term with their father's legacy, and specifically what their fathers did or didn't do during the Nazi years. Although in some ways it's tempting to place Schneider's story in this context, it does differ in some significant ways from these other texts. Namely, it is primarily, these other texts were primarily autobiographical. Schneider's text is clearly fictional. Although, interestingly enough, Rolf Mengele, who, although he's not named in the text, is clearly the person on whom this text the narrator is based, lived in the same town and attended the same school as Schneider, but still there's a clear differentiation. And of course, in these other texts, the fathers involved were what you might call Mitläufer, or fellow travelers who sort of went along with things. But of course, Schneider's story, although not specifically by name, clearly is dealing with perhaps the most notorious and sought after of all Nazi criminals during this time. Just a little bit of information about Peter Schneider first. He was born in 1940 in the city of Königsberg, which was then part of East Prussia. It is the town, by the way, in which the philosopher Immanuel Kant lived. But after the war, it became part of Russia, as now the city of Kaliningrad. Peter Schneider's father, by all accounts, was a musician who had absolutely no political role in the Nazi regime. So in that sense, Peter Schneider has a very different background than the narrator of this text, and that's important to keep in mind. His family moved after the war to Freiburg in the southwestern region of Germany. Schneider went to school there, and as I mentioned, Rolf Mengele also attended the same school. Schneider began his university studies in '59, first in Freiburg, then in Munich, and then he actually moved to Berlin, and interestingly enough, it was in 1962, shortly after the wall was put up. I heard it suggested that part of his motivation was the fact that West Berliners were exempt from the requirement of military service that other young Germans were subject to. I can't vouch for whether that's correct or not, but that may have been a factor. And Berlin has remained his home ever since. In the 60s, he was a real student radical. He was very much involved with the student movement. And interestingly enough, because of this, in 1972, he applied for a certification for a teaching job, and he was denied this because he was declared a Verfassungsfeind, which means literally an enemy of the Constitution. And this is kind of remarkable. This was now under the more left-wing social democratic government of Willy Brandt, but still there was this great sense of fear of the left-wing radicals, which is also a kind of theme in the story in interesting ways. He was subsequently exonerated of that charge, but he chose to pursue a career as a writer, which he's been doing ever since, writing a number of works of fiction as well as essays. He's been in the US a number of times. He's had either visiting professorships or writer-in-residence positions at Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Georgetown. And one thing that's striking about him is that without in any way really renouncing his left-wing politics, he has in many issues taken what I would say is a much more nuanced view of things and not fallen strictly into the party line on a number of issues. One of his most famous works is called Der Mauerspringer from 1982. And it's still a very widely acclaimed work. It has been translated into English. And really it's looking at the division of Berlin and Germany from both sides in a very interesting way. Now, I'd like to jump to talk about the background for this story. Many of you are probably familiar with the name Josef Mengele, who's been called, he was nicknamed the Angel of Death from Auschwitz. He was born in 1911. He came from a rather prosperous manufacturing family. He pursued his doctorate first in anthropology, and then that same year, 1937, he joined the Nazi Party, and he was very much wrapped up in this ideology of racial hygiene and eugenics. He received his medical degree, and that same year he joined the SS and was then recruited as a medical officer for the Waffen-SS, this very elite Nazi corps. He worked in 1940 as a medical consultant for what was called the Race and Settlement Main Office. Get a clear idea of what that's all about. He did serve for a while on the Eastern Front. He was wounded, and then he returned to Germany. He worked for a while at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics, and Eugenics. Then in 1943, he was promoted to SS captain, and he was then transferred to Auschwitz. During his time there, although he was just one of a number of physicians who were involved in the so-called selection process, and I think we all know by now what that means. It means who got to go directly to the gas chambers and who would be used for labor for as long as they could be useful, which in most cases, given the conditions there, was not very long. However, he gained quite a reputation there as someone who was just extraordinarily callous and carefree. He would whistle these classical melodies while he was sending people off to the gas chambers. And I just want to share a very kind of chilling recent experience. I gave a presentation just earlier this year at a Holocaust survivors group, and I told them a little bit about the story. You know, I mentioned the name Josef Mengele, and looked at me and said, "Oh yes, I remember him." So, you know, he somehow, in spite of the fact he was not the only one, he gained this very particular reputation. That was due in large part to his experiments. He conducted a number of very gruesome medical experiments on children, especially twins. There was a great obsession with twins at this time. And all of this was based on Nazi racial theory. Then, after the war, prior to the Russians sort of overrunning the camp, Mengele fled to the West. He was taken prisoner by the American troops, but, and this is one of the chilling things, although his name already was on a list of wanted Nazi criminals, somehow the American authorities were not cognizant of this, and he was released shortly afterward. For 4 years, he remained in Germany, relatively untouched. He was sort of working undercover as a farmhand in Bavaria, but knowing that things were getting a little worse and there was more and more of an effort to track down these war criminals, he did, with the financial assistance of his family, emigrate to South America. First to Argentina, and as you probably know, Argentina gained a reputation as a very reliable place of refuge for Nazi criminals. In 1959, after all those years, West Germany did issue a warrant for his arrest and extradition, so that certainly put him on his guard. And then, of course, even more so in 1960, you may remember the Israeli Mossad did find Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, and then they deported him to Israel, where he was tried and executed. And so clearly Mengele took this as a kind of sign that he needed to get out. He went first to Paraguay and then to Brazil, where he was to remain for the rest of his life. In 1985, his son, Rolf Mengele, finally revealed that he had visited his father in Brazil in 1977, and that his father had in fact died there in 1979. He had a stroke while swimming and drowned. And there were then subsequent forensic tests which did confirm this, although there were and still remain skeptics. There are those who feel that this was just a ruse to allow him to escape capture. So who knows? The following year, 1986, two American authors, Gerald Posner and John Ware, published Mengele, The Complete Story, which really remains sort of the defining account of Mengele's career. Just wanted to show you just one page of this, the first of these articles, and it was a whole series. This is, just to translate for you, exclusive. The sun breaks his silence. Mengele, this is how he deceived the world. And then up in the corner here, this photo of his father. Rolf Mengele took this photo of his father in 1977. It shows the concentration camp physician, Dr. Josef Mengele, in the cove in which 2 years later in 1979, according to his son, he was drowned. So it's, as you can sort of judge from the cover, this is a kind of a slightly sensationalist magazine with not a very sophisticated reputation, although the articles did try to be relatively objective. But it was 2 years after this that Schneider published his story. Even before it was in print, he was attacked in Der Spiegel, which is the main news weekly in Germany, for plagiarism, because he had just borrowed a few phrases from these articles, which he clearly adapted. And, this is a little absurd. I mean, first of all, Schneider had employed a similar technique in some of his earlier texts. And then, this whole technique of literary montage, that is, taking snippets from other texts, is hardly a new idea, a new device. And as if that weren't enough, the German public was very well aware of these articles. This was a huge publication, and in fact, even Schneider had called attention to it in an article for the New York Times he wrote that year. So, and he actually requested the publisher put in an acknowledgement of the source of some of these quotes. They chose not to do it. But for some reason, this story clearly set off, some alarms in the German kind of general public. And because of this charge of plagiarism, the publisher of the magazine, Bunte, obtained an injunction which for a while barred the distribution of the book, but that was then withdrawn after a while, and it was distributed and has remained in print since. However, it's interesting to note that it still remains kind of a touchy subject in the German-speaking world. There is by now quite a substantial body of critical literature, but almost all of it is in the English language. There's an Irish or Welsh scholar, Colin Riordan, who's written a great deal about it, and a number of other very interesting, thought-provoking articles, but almost all in English. And then what's still sort of I find flabbergasting, and I will be sharing some clips from this film with you. In 2002, Schneider's story was the basis of a film starring, you won't believe this, Charlton Heston as Josef Mengele. And yeah, and this film is totally unavailable. Try to get it in DVD, good luck with that. I fortunately have some skilled colleagues who are able to download it from the internet for me, which is why I can make it available to you today. But, you know, this again sort of confirms the notion that there is something a little creepy about this story for so many readers. And it hasn't been translated, and of course I have now translated it and still looking for a publisher, and you can wish me well with that. Now, what I want to do now is share a few snippets from the story, and I'm going to interweave them with some clips from the film, because I think they give you, to some degree, the film follows the course of the story, although it does diverge in some ways that I will be pointing out. This is the very beginning of the story now, and I think it's very interesting to see the kind of narrative technique here. It is clearly a first person. I saw him in January, and then you asked me what I expected. From the very beginning, it's clear that this whole narrative is being addressed to someone. At the beginning, we have no idea who this someone is, but in the course of the story, we learn that this someone is an old schoolmate of the narrator's, who has been out of touch with him for years, but since he revealed this information, is now interested in hearing his story. So basically, he's sort of giving an account of his visit to his father in Brazil. And then, he just gives all these random details. I saw the man in the windbreaker, hockey pants, shirt, bald head. He looks like everyone or like no one, I thought. And then my mind went blank. We have, this is one of many kind of very interesting kind of responses to seeing his father. And then, of course, he is sort of frozen there, doesn't know what to do. And then by accident, he's sort of, he happens to be standing in this very muddy street in a very kind of not very nice part of the city of Berlin. And then he loses his balance, and he grabs it, so he accidentally sort of holds on to his father, and then his father embraces him. And then, of course, so he holds on to his father, and then, of course, right away, he feels the need to justify that. Thousands of sons have embraced their fathers, regardless of what these fathers may have done. And this is part of an ongoing sort of discourse of back and forth. I have to reject this man, but then he's my father. And then, he addresses this classmate of his, says, you say I should never have gone there in the first place, I should have let him waste away, die a miserable death. And of course, he says, you think I didn't give myself the same advice, and until the last minute I was thinking that I shouldn't do this. But then he makes an interesting observation. Not to go there would doubtless have been more comfortable and as pathetic as the statement that the stork brought me to my mother. So do you get a sense of where he's going with this? Basically, he's saying, yeah, it would have been easy to never see this schmuck ever, but, he's my father, and I can't pretend he's not. It's like telling fairy tales about a stork carrying the baby.
That's how it used to be.
Now, I'm sorry, I want to give a little introduction to this film clip. So now, he begins by talking about his visit to Brazil, but then he flashes back to his time in school, the time when the person to whom he's addressing this narrative knew him. And this first clip is in a time when basically his family has withheld from him the truth about his father. They've told him, oh, your father went missing in Russia. And yet he goes into school and he senses that that people are looking at him strangely because of his name. And so I think this clip will give you a good feeling for that, at least. Let's start. One thing, by the way, I forgot to mention about this film. The director is Italian. However, if you see the film credits, they'll say, an Italian-Hungarian-Brazilian production. So if anyone can figure that out, I've tried to research, how this film came to be, and the information is very, very limited. So anyway, let's move on now to the next slide. Okay, and now this is another passage from the story, which I think is interesting, where he's talking about images, photographs from the camps. And he says, he's talking about trying to somehow bring these photographs together with the family pictures of his father. He said, I have never placed one group next to the others. I had to decide between them. And then, he begins to talk about, sort of reflect on the legacy of the Holocaust. He says, I can and will never deny the crime that they document, even if I must admit that to this day I'm unable to grasp all details. He talks about a blinding dizziness, a weakness in his constitution, or an impulse to flee. But then, he expresses this kind of frustration that I sort of referred to when I heard from a student before. Why must I insist again and again on every occasion? Yes, I hate the concentration camps. You hear him shifting from this, clearly acknowledging the horrors to, expressing his frustration about, having to deal with it constantly. But which, of course, is, I think, an issue for more collectively for Germans, but in his case, of course, it's a very, very specific issue. And then he makes this general reflection, talking about how these documented German crime for which the history of mankind knows no equivalent, but they do not show the criminal. And then he says, I don't know to this day what share my father had in the crimes, but then he says, one thing is certain, only an entire people is capable of exterminating an entire people. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a very, appropriate statement, acknowledging some collective responsibility among Germans for the Holocaust, but in the context of this story, we can also read it somewhat differently, by saying that it's only the whole people, the whole, nation that is responsible. That is, of course, a way of shifting some of the burden off his own shoulders and his family's. So it's interesting to see that. Now, here's another quick point to look at. He's talking here, and this is a very interesting issue, about how the students of the 60s generation dealt with the Nazi legacy. And a lot of them talked about emancipating themselves from their fathers. Even they used the term patricide, to talk about their total break with their fathers. And then, of course, he indicates how that he doesn't have much respect for them. He said, when on top of that, you declared to me that your old man was now dead to you and all connection with him broken off, all I thought was, yeah, until the monthly check, that he'll accept. So clearly calling into question the sincerity and the genuineness of this generation's attempt to distance themselves from their parents. But then he also talks about the difference between him and the person to whom he's addressing this. That is, it's one thing to talk about having a father who was a fellow traveler, who didn't speak up, who was in some small way complicit. It's another thing to have a father who has a 5-figure bounty placed on his head. And so he says, my only choice was to conceal or to betray him. Those are the only 2 choices. And he says, maybe you can forgive me for seeing in the fellow traveler only a perpetrator who, for lack of opportunity, never became a murderer, perhaps out of calculation as well. And, this is a statement we can maybe contemplate, but certainly, spoken by him, it is a self-serving statement, one that says, well, your father could just as easily have been a mass murderer as mine. But then, again, there's this interesting comment at the end, the hope that I could free myself from my father with a few hastily memorized quotes from Mao or Che Guevara was never permitted to me. So what's he talking about here? He's talking about the way in which these left-wing students thought that, oh, hey, we're left-wingers, so obviously we're not Nazis. Obviously, we have nothing to do with that. And here I think he makes the very valid point that there is something a little bit questionable about that whole tactic. I just want to pause here and remind you that it's always crucial in reading any work of prose fiction to think about the narrator and not confuse him or her with the author. And I think that, especially in a text like this, that's a really crucial step to take. Because, yes, there are a few moments where I think Peter Schneider would not totally dispute what the narrator is saying, but at other moments, there is something intensely problematic. So that's always important.
He was the one who forced me.
Okay, so now this next clip takes place again when he's still relatively young, but now he has finally heard the news. He finally knows the truth about his father. His father, whom they had been referred to as his uncle, and received letters from Argentina as a kid, and he had actually met with him once in the Alps, but all this time thought, oh, this is my uncle. But now he knows the truth. This is some of his reflections on that. Oops, sorry. Go back here. Okay, sorry, got cut off there. But a few interesting things here. The Shanghai Terrorists, these were the members of the Baader-Meinhof gang, who were the most notorious of the left-wing terrorists during the 60s in Germany, who were imprisoned, and they, by all accounts, several of them committed suicide while in prison. And so this is a very interesting kind of issue here. Again, on the one hand, we have left-wing student protesters who use that left-wing kind of identity to ward off any sense of responsibility for the Nazi past. But at the same time, you're dealing with a situation where, and this is another major issue in the text, that although there's a great deal of paranoia on the part of his father when he says in advance of his trip, you have to take all these precautions. You have to first take a bus here and then get a ticket here, make sure that no one who is on the bus, is boarding the same flight, and blah, blah, blah. And then he says, oh, this was totally superfluous. Yes, the German government is very intent on tracking down left-wing terrorists, but Nazi criminals they're not all that interested in, and that's certainly one of the issues here. But there's also the notion that, of course, they are kind of assuming that the Germans really killed these terrorists in prison, and of course, the narrator, who is, by the way, an attorney by training, saying, no, we don't have the death penalty. And of course, his father's friends dismiss that, and then his father goes off on one of his usual discourses on, sort of his Nazi morality, which he has still stuck to for all these years. And then here's another moment of the text, which is very interesting. Just in one of his totally kind of frustrated and disoriented moments, he pulls out his wallet, shows his father the picture of his fiancée, and he says, for the first time, this is the narrator speaking, for the first time I realized that she was blonde and blue-eyed. That seems a little bit dubious, I would say. He didn't notice that about his fiancée until now. But what he's really saying is it didn't occur to him that this was, perhaps something he inherited from his father, some sort of disposition towards the blonde and blue-eyed. And then, of course, his father sees this picture and is very pleased, very approving. And when he said, finally an offspring of our clan has chosen a woman from beyond the northern river boundary, and he said, one may anticipate the best from these new combinations. And at this point, he's just filled with fury, and he actually puts his hands around his father's neck. And he says, no, I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted to silence him. I want to shake that unbearable calmness from his limbs. And then, so he is at first filled with rage, but then he reflects on, oh yeah, how the world would celebrate me if I murdered my father. But then, interestingly enough, even more than them, I hated my father's persecutors. Not even now, when I'd showed them the way, did they break the door open and free me. If they had just finally arrested him and put him on trial, I would have had to look on as he fell silent. So it's interesting. He hates his father's persecutors because they're not doing their job. So it's a very kind of complicated sort of web of feelings that it's very interesting to. And then he makes this very defining statement about the work, where he says about this whole text. In that second, I had to realize, however we deal with this fact, we are the sons and daughters of the perpetrators. We are not the children of the victims. And this, here again, this is a statement worth considering that, yes, there is a tendency, certainly among Germans to kind of just identify with the victims and thus, in a way, to shed their feeling of guilt. But, he states flatly, no, we can never do that. We are the children of the perpetrators. Okay, now here's another, this is a part of the story that is not represented in the film, and is one, in some ways, the perplexing ones. He is, at this moment, when he nearly strangles his father, just so wrought up that he runs out the door, he goes for a walk in the city, and he starts obsessively following this girl that he sees. She's actually carrying a portable typewriter, which he takes to a pawn shop midway. But he is totally obsessed with her. I couldn't see her face, only her dark-colored neck and her legs that were naked up to the thigh. She was beautiful, at least striking. This could be deduced from the astonished, sometimes grimacing expressions of the men walking towards her. And then, he keeps following her. She's beautiful, defiant and beautiful, but her beauty actually repelled me. It didn't remind me of anything. So he's going back and forth, and just skipping to the end here. In that moment, when he comes very close to her, my chest tensed up to drag her into the hallway of some building and tear her clothes off, or to fall to my knees before her. I wasn't capable of anything in between. So you might ask, what in the world is going on here? How is this in any way related to what is going on in the story? But in a sense, you can see this parallel to his relationship with his father. On the one hand, one moment wanting to murder him, at the next moment feeling, this is my father, I should be protecting him. And then, very kind of revealing moment, he says, then at the moment where he is so close to her, I stretched out my half-raised arm as if to perform the hateful greeting that I had never learned. What do you think he's referring to here? Nazi salute. But then he came out instead with a sporty British sounding hello, and then walked off.
Oh.
So, now let me see.
You mean?
Sorry. Just a little preparation here. So, having returned from this, he finally, he has been planning all along to put some questions to his father, and now he basically begins that questioning. Okay. Following that scene, he of course has to get away and sort of cool down, but then his father announces that he's planned an excursion for them, and talking about how I know you live in the Black Forest region, but I'm going to show you a real forest, he says. And so he takes him but after a very lengthy trip, into this forest in Brazil. Now, what is very interesting is earlier in the now this is in the text, he refers to the fact that when he was very sort of upset and agitated, the one thing that would always soothe him was listening to a particular work by Brahms, the G major string quintet. And in the text, of course, his father has brought this little cassette recorder with him into the jungle, and what music does he play? He plays that very same piece. For some reason in the movie, this is changed from this G major sextet to a movement from Brahms' Requiem, set to the text, for all flesh is like grass. So perhaps that text was found appropriate. But this is, so this, will explain to you his sort of look of shock. This realization that, oh my God, that maybe we have some connection, that maybe, we are alike. Okay, I think that gives you a sufficient idea there. Move on to the next. So now, when they return from this excursion, I'm just going to summarize now what happens in the last pages. He returns to his hotel, having to go, and then discovers that his money has been stolen from his wallet. And then he figures it has to be the hotel keeper who stole, and he goes to the police and reports the hotel keeper. But in this rather corrupt little town, the hotel keeper is with the police and manages to point the finger at his maid, who is innocent, and she is the one who is then arrested and subjected to punishment. So, again, just to put this in the larger context, this narrator, who is either unwilling or unable to turn in a mass murderer, his father, yet becomes responsible for the arrest of an innocent nobleman. And this is, in the final pages, except the very last page, he hears of his father's death, and then he talks about that. And he says, the suspicion that many had that his death was specious, and he says, I can't defend myself against this suspicion. I fear that no death certificate and no expert assessment will entirely overcome it. And then this very sort of striking statement towards the end. The world does not want to allow my father to die because it cannot bear the thought that my father too belongs to the Universities. And I think on that note, let me just sum up that this is a very complex text that, especially if you think about that final quotation, yes, I think there is some truth to that we have to face the fact that some of the most horrendous monsters of history were human beings, and we cannot demonize them and somehow place them outside of our frame of reference by doing so. But at the same time, this narrator is a very kind of tainted person because of his own complicity, which is, in a sense, an inherited one. I mean, is he guilty because of his father? It's easy to say no. But is this a burden he can ever shed? The answer to that, I would say, is also no. So let me ask if you have any questions or thoughts about this. I wish I could tell you when the translation will be appearing in print, but I will keep you posted.
Thank you.
Is Rolf Mengele known to have any kind of reaction to the book? Like, was he asked about the book or comment on it?
That's a good question. I haven't heard, all the literature I've read, there's no reference to that. I think he's been trying to keep a very low profile. So I think probably he's avoided making any public statements. Yes?
I guess I'm sort of reminded of Sophie's Choice, of a book that dealt with a very dark episode in semi-fictional way.
Right.
And then sort of wonder, when you walk this around to publishers, what is the response? Is it that the content is too dark, or is just bad?
So far, I've just gotten, the general response, no, we really can't. I don't think people have even really looked at the text yet. So I think part of it is the length. I mean, it's about 60 pages, so 60 pages. And, I'm certainly very interested in doing a substantial introduction, contextualizing it for an English language audience. But, that I think is part of the problem. But I will keep working at it.
why do you think the DVD is so hard, impossible?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I wish I knew the answer. Again, I can only say that, you know, there seems to be this stigma attached to the story. Maybe Charles Heston, of course, politically is also a little bit questionable, perhaps for the people, the very people who might be interested in this film. So that's also perhaps a complicating factor. But I mean, to me, it was quite, it came as a total shock to see that there was a film based on the story. And then when I saw who the actor was, I mean, it totally blew my mind. And I haven't really gotten much clarification about how that happened and how it is that this film is so unavailable. So I wish I knew the answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for introducing me to the film. I thought that was very fascinating. You know, what struck me in your presentation is that this relationship between a father and a son, you think, and I think you alluded to this once, but do you see it as maybe a larger relationship of that parent generation that lived through World War II, the perpetrators, and the children of the post-war?
Yeah. Well, I think
in that larger context,
right.
That legacy,
right.
How to do with the legacy.
Right.
What struck me also in that text is often those ellipses at the end. You know, it seems like it doesn't.
Oh, those are I'm sorry, the ellipses are where, you know, when I was just
okay.
so that no, I'm to blame for those. But to your question, I mean, I think in a sense it certainly does speak to the larger issue. Certainly does of how his generation deals with this legacy. But I think, on the other hand, and I remember you sort of made me really aware of this, that it is in that, however, very different from the other examples of Väter Literatur, that, you know, Schneider has deliberately chosen a case with, well, first of all, it's not autobiographical, it's not his father he's talking about, and second of all, he's talking about the most notorious of the war criminals. So in that sense, he is pushing the envelope. He is clearly choosing an extreme and atypical case. But at the same time, I think he is trying to weigh, is it really that different from, you know, what other children of this generation have to deal with? You know, that, I mean, for instance, the comment at the end that, yes, we want to demonize him. We want to say he's a devil. He is not a human being. And it is precisely the thought that someone like this is a human being that we have such a hard time dealing with. And I think to some degree that does apply to any of the children of that generation. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is, in that sense, very much a part of that general dialogue. Yes?
In your quest to get publication, have you considered the Holocaust Museum in Washington, talking to them?
No, I haven't. That's an interesting idea. I think that might be a possibility. Thank you. Yes?
Thanks very much. You mentioned the word Vergangenheitsbewältigung being rather difficult to translate into English elegantly.
I don't think so much that it's difficult to translate as that the most common translation is maybe a little problematic. I mean, coming to terms with or dealing with the past, yeah, I mean, that's a comfortable translation that sounds okay in English, but it doesn't quite capture this whole notion of bewältigen, you know, to master, gain mastery over something, to gain power over it. And so I don't think it's so much the linguistic problem as a kind of conceptual one. But I'm sorry I interrupted.
Well, I was just wondering about the way Mengele speaks in the novel in German, and whether that posed any problems for you as a translator, whether his diction or his vocabulary derives from kind of Third Reich parlance, and if that posed any problems for you as a translator.
I think there were a few challenges along the way, but yes, clearly his discourse, I mean, his language is very much, and at one point, you know, the narrator says, oh, Vati, diese Substantive, these substantives, he sort of referring to his very inflated kind of speech. So yeah, I mean, he is at that point responding to the language and not so much to the content. But yeah, no, the language is certainly very, very expressive of, his Nazi ideology.
My question is, you use the film here to present for us something. Is it supporting the book, or you just wanted to make the issue for us more clear? What is at stake?
I mean, okay, why did I use the clips from the film? I thought it would sort of pique your curiosity, as it does mine, to see that this story was the basis of a film with a very major actor. By the way, one part of the film I didn't show is that another sort of subplot of the film is that he is being kind of questioned by an attorney who's representing the New York Jewish community, who's played by F. Murray Abraham, another well-known actor. So I thought the film, the parts of the film that I chose are ones that are relatively faithful to the story. So I thought that would be a good way to sort of acquaint you with some aspects of the story.
Because you really showed us the burden what the subsequent generations are dealing with and never can share. It's just a continuous engagement.
Any other questions or thoughts? Well, thank you all.
Thank you all. Please help me thank Professor Kovach.